Okay, we might get started now. I hope everyone's found themselves a seat. So, Wominjeka, welcome everyone to the Social Change Graduate Research Conference opening talk. I'm Tanya Lewis. I'm a Professor of Media and Communication here at RMIT. And like our speaker tonight, I have a background in cultural studies, as do a few folk in this room that I recognise. But first, I'd just like to thank the wonderful college research ops team who've done a fantastic job organising the conferences this week, but also bringing Susan safely from Adelaide to Melbourne. So thank you very much to Catherine, who's here, and Nicole, and also to Hannah for their kind of behind the scenes labour. And I'd also like to really warmly welcome everyone from across the college, which for those of you who are unfamiliar to RMIT, so we have a College of Design and Social Context. So the conferences that we're running for our graduate students run across the college. And I see in the audience today we've got folk from probably most of the schools within DSC, which is fantastic to see. So everything from art through to education, built environment, social sciences, architecture, urban planning, fashion and textiles, and of course media and communication, which includes music industries and also creative writing. So really a huge array of areas and fields. So I think the topic of Susan's talk today on the importance of craft and making skills in a digital context, as you can see, it's a really nice fit with the kind of broad array of research that we do here at RMIT across our graduate research and also schools. So before I turn to Susan's talk, I want to offer an acknowledgement to country. And part of this acknowledgement, I want to recognise the role of diverse Indigenous craft skills and knowledges in shaping our heritage. And here at RMIT's CBD campus, we work on the land of the traditional owners of Melbourne's CBD and inner urban areas, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people. I acknowledge that these lands have always been places of making, learning and teaching, and that sovereignty has never been ceded, and that this was and always will be Aboriginal land. We have some symbolic markers of that on the campus, and in fact, as I was walking here tonight, I walked past a significant large sculpture we have on campus on Bowen Lane entitled The Law of the Land. So that sculpture seeks to foreground this issue of unceded rule. And if you haven't seen the sculpture, I'd encourage you to go and have a look at it. It's a possum skin cloak that's been fashioned out of iron and designed by Gudjit Mada Kere Wurrung woman, Dr. Vicky Cousins, who also happens to be a research fellow here in Media and Communication. For thousands of years, Indigenous people across Southeast Asia, and that includes Victoria, have crafted possum skin cloaks, while Wurundjeri women have a strong matrilineal culture and tradition of weaving, among many, many other skills and craft knowledges. So along with the question of stolen land, Dr. Cousins' iron-forged version of memorialisation of a possum skin cloak reminds us that we need to pay heed to often forgotten and unacknowledged Indigenous skills and knowledge in relation to making and craft. So that's by means of a segue to the wonderful talk that we're having tonight that Susan will be presenting, and I'm super pleased to be able to introduce Sue. So given the title of your talk, Susan, I have to say I couldn't help but ask ChatGPT for a little bio summary. And well, look, I wasn't surprised when it came up with a not very useful, very generic bio, but it did come out with one sentence that I thought sums you up. So it said you're a distinguished scholar in the field of cultural studies with a focus on gender, identity and creative industries, which is pretty spot on. But according to ChatGPT, you also spend your time apparently wandering around art galleries, which is probably a safe bet, and also penning your next piece of fiction, I quote, which I don't think is true. No. So Yeah, so hence the analogue world is still probably going to be needed. What I can verify is that Susan, over the past couple of decades, has published on a very wide range of subjects within the broad realm of creative and cultural industries. And many of the folk in the audience, I know we've got some music industries folk here and people from Monash working in the music space, who will remember Susan's really seminal work on rave culture back in the 2000s. I have to say, for some of us, it feels like yesterday, but, you know, let's not go there. And I also recall reading some of your work on creative cities and creative regionalism, which I guess would have been around 10 years ago. And I recall also reading a very prescient piece that you wrote back in 2013 on Etsy, which was really prescient in the sense that it was really speaking to the kind of resurgence of interest in artisanal skills and craft culture, etc., very much looking towards, I guess, some of the things that you're going to be talking about tonight. So it's in this critical space of craft, creative labour, gender, the politics of identity within a digital era that Susan's work has made a major international contribution in the past decade. And I won't list all the books that you've published, but a couple of key works are Locating Cultural Work and more recently Craftspeople and Designer Makers in the Contemporary Creative Economy. And Susan actually hails from Melbourne, as some of you will know, so welcome home. Did her PhD in Cultural Studies in Queensland, but has actually been in Adelaide for the last couple of decades, I guess now, where she's now the Professor of Culture and Creative Industries and also the Director of the Creative People, Products and Places Research Centre, CP3 at the University of South Australia, which soon may also have a new title. And according to me, not ChatGPT, in her spare time, she's also a chief investigator on 2 ARC discovery projects relating both to local craft skills and the future of making in Australia. So can we please welcome Susan Luckman.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Tanya, and I'd also like to extend my thanks to the organising team for getting me here so seamlessly and for making the event run so smoothly so far, fingers crossed. And thank you all for being here tonight. As a few people pointed out, it's sort of the first really nice warm day, and I think it was Tanya that pointed out it's perfect beer drinking weather. So I'm grateful at least you'll be able to have some beer to drink in here while I talk, or maybe some sparkling water, whatever. It's wonderful to be back here in my hometown, as Tanya said. I actually got my first ever parking ticket out there on Swanston Street. That shows you how old I am. You could park on Swanston Street, but not after 8 a.m. on a Sunday, I learnt, having been in the Catalyst office all night using their desktop publishing for some political agitprop. But before I go any further, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we are on today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and also acknowledge that I live and work, as it's been indicated, on the lands and waters of the Kaurna people in Tandanya, Adelaide. So for those of you who don't know me, although I think everyone knows me by now, I'm nervous about ChatGPT thinking I'm a fiction writer. I don't know what that says about the current state of cultural studies in the world of AI. I'm reading a really interesting book that connects AI and craft and the history. The Jacquard Loom and the work of Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage at the moment is doing a really rich social history about AI, but clearly we need to do an intervention there, those of us who are in cultural studies, if that's a representation of some of the things that are coming out. But for those of you who don't know me, some of these books have already been evoked, but I'm an interdisciplinary cultural studies worker whose research examines creative places and people. I, in particular, have adopted a science and technology studies approach over the years. It came from my early master's thesis work, actually, which was about cyberfeminism in the 1990s, back when only 1 in 10 people on the internet identified as a woman. Doesn't seem so long ago in many ways, but it's interesting to compare that particular digital moment to the generative AI one. So some of the books that I've been involved in to give a sense of the story of getting here. Pro tip number 1 today, never put a piece of technology on your book cover. Nothing dates a book like technology. I'll just leave that there for people as my key pro tip for today. So it seems appropriate to kick off this particular discussion today with one of many similar quotes from research participants in this study I'll be speaking to, and which I'll introduce shortly. This one comes from a mascot costume making company in outer Melbourne. And to read, for those who may not be able to read that too clearly, we've had work experience people, but the ones we've had haven't got they just can't pick it up. It's one of those things that you either have or you don't. And the sewing, you don't get patterns per se. You get a lot of fabric together and the girls just know what it is because they've been doing it so long. My concern is that all these ladies, no matter how much they love it, they'll retire and there won't be that next generation. You don't hear a lot of people doing it nowadays, sewing and things. So while the textiles is only one part of the wider world of skilled craft production I wish to speak to today, it's a sector I'm particularly interested in, both personally, having grown up in a family of intergenerational sewers, as well as because of all Australian manufacturing sectors, this one is the gender outlier, the feminised one, and thus the one most ignored, I would argue, by government policy for several decades now. But in so many ways, despite this particularity, this quote exemplifies the problem I wish to speak to today: the loss of traditional craft and making skills as the digital is fetishised above all else. And I wish to foreground why this matters. And given clothing and textiles is such a basic part of human life, it also matters that this is a sector at the very coalface of why it matters who makes and the conditions under which they make, and the materials and supply chains they access to do this. So I probably don't need to remind this room greater attention to the provenance of what we buy, especially in the fashion industry, following the tragedy of the 2013 Rana Plaza disaster, where 1,134 mostly garment workers died in Bangladesh when the building they were in collapsed. This is now coupled with increased attention to the environmental impacts, as well as environmental impacts of making processes, of demand for repair and customisation, as well as quality, well-crafted goods, meaning that there is increasing demand in Australia, as well as elsewhere across the world, for a return to local manufacturing, seeking to at least in part undo the offshoring of manufacturing that occurred in the 1970s and 80s. This process was accelerated, as we know, by the COVID pandemic, but was already in train. But when I talk to people in creative industry policy context today about this, while in the textiles context they might be keen to support the promotion of local designers as part of creative place promotion and creative industries policy initiatives, a common lament remains, but we can't get any sewers. The role of creative industries approaches as the dominant cultural policy setting in arriving at this point is something I'll return to briefly at the end of this talk if there's time. But before going any further, I really should introduce the project from which all this comes. Woohoo. So just quickly, the value of craft skills to the future of making in Australia was an Australian Research Council discovery project that ended up being a 5-year project so I could accommodate getting the 2021 census data. I was going to originally just do it based on 2016, but in 2021, 2022, relying on data that was pre-COVID about who was making and where they were employed would have been a complete no-brainer. So I worked heavily with data from the census, as it says here in part 1 of the project, a quantitative mapping of the economic and employment size, scale and location of craft workers within the Australian economy using that census data. And when I say craft, I mean very broadly. I'll define that in a moment. And activity 2 was a more traditional semi-structured interview field work where it was possible, Zoom, where unfortunately during the pandemic it mostly wasn't, of interviews with some of the people identified as part of activity 1. So for the purposes of this study, the definition of craft skills has been broadened out from its association with handicrafts and arts practice to also capture a range of making practices whereby skill is employed to work with materials to create, make or design an original object, even if this design is then replicated. This also includes practices of repair. Moving beyond a simple inclusion of all trade labour, what this seeks to capture is not only the skills implicit in craft practice, but also the innovation and original thinking captured by the verb to craft. The project applied a similar approach to that undertaken in a previous study into the British craft economy by the UK Crafts Council. The UK work defining and measuring craft, a review, spanned a series of 3 reports, and the study was deemed necessary at the time. Many of you will be familiar with the fact that the DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, in the UK's definition of creative industries, emerged in the 1990s as a really dominant one around much of the world. What they were thinking of doing, however, was their definition brought in software and sort of a lot of the digital kind of side of things, that really big industries where it was easy to multiply things because you didn't need individual hands to actually make something. They were trying to get rid of crafts from their definition of creative industries because they're just sort of as busy, hard to capture data on, not particularly economically big. But at the same time, we're happy to sort of stick with having software and the reproduction of a software tool just manually, mass-produced, millions of copies in the definition of creative industries. So this would have had huge ramifications for crafts funding and recognition in the UK. So the Crafts Council did this report to try and capture the kind of importance of these kind of skills, not just in the art space, but across the whole economy. The other big debate they were having there that I think is starting to come home to roost here much more too is making the argument for the importance of access to these kind of experiences of arts, craft and making in schools, primary schools, high schools, the tertiary sector, and just really trying to make key points for the importance of it. So this was an attempt to distance the larger, more big end of town friendly, contemporary and more easily scalable digital intellectual property generation distribution businesses from the statistically messier, smaller scale, frequently individualised and often part-time world of craft, and would have had all sorts of funding implications, as I said. So all of this occurred, ironically, at a time of huge growth for the design and craft and handmade sectors around the globe, including the UK, as Tanya's already indicated. And it was interesting that these also coincided with the moment when a lot of governments were looking to these sectors to counteract a lot of the offshoring of making to cheaper labour markets. So applying the definitions above, of the 1,000, this is where I go into a bit of maths, excuse me. It's one of the things I do on weekends. I actually quite like maths. Of the 1,353 occupations listed in the Australian and New Zealand classification of occupations list, we identified 114 as ultimately having some kind of craft activity or at least some degree of craft skill to successfully undertake everyday tasks in that job. There's a huge amount of detail in the report you can access through that QR code. We didn't take everybody in all those 114 occupations. Some we took more of, something like glass blowing, you go, yeah, okay, they're all craft. Others, people who were particular kinds of plasterers, we didn't take all of them. We had other proxies for were they likely to be doing more skilled kinds of work. So we ended up, as I said, on this basis, craft skills are essential to successful material production innovation in much of the Australian economy, in everything from building and construction. For textiles, the glam sector was another big key one that was actually growing, galleries, libraries, archives, museums, medical and scientific equipment through to design engineering. Now, a key take-home that is revealed, and this is why it was important to get the 2021 census, because in many ways it just proved a sort of gut feeling I already had. If you look at this, you can see that craft as an employment, total employment, has been steadily going down. No surprises there. A little bit of stabilisation between 2016 and 2021. The thing that's really interesting for me is GVA, gross value added, we used the proxy of income, people's salaries and what is declared in the census for that. And I can talk to the faults of the census data in Q&A if people wish to. But what you'll note there is there's quite a big jump in the amount of money that people are making. And that increasingly was showing that these are skills in demand, but but we aren't getting them. They aren't out there so much anymore. So the people who still have them, as anyone who's tried to get somebody to do this kind of work for them will be increasingly finding, they're much harder to get. I know I was walking past a suit store in Adelaide a couple of months ago, and it was a really expensive suit store, and they were advertising, or making it clear that if you bought a suit, the kind of tailoring you would expect to go with the price of that suit no longer came as part of it. You'd have to pay $200 additionally, and they specifically said due to the shortage of tailors. So we've actually got this point where even the big end of town is finding it hard to find the right people to do this, and it's present in the data there. So this trend is perhaps better seen in this graph, where the percentage of craft employment there is coming down and stabilising, but you've got the overall amount of wealth being generated by craft employment in Australia is stabilising. So what this doesn't quite reveal is the degree to which this is all at risk. So there's a mountain of data, as I said, of the overall project findings, as well as more of the interview material in this report that I've highlighted here. But at the heart of this, there is a story of decline and of taking for granted or even overtly dismissing the skills of people who know how to actually make and repair physical things beyond new builds and mining extraction. That Australia will always have skilled makers is something that's been taken for granted, but since manufacturing was offshored in the 1980s, the ecosystem of specialised suppliers, processors, fabricators, raw materials producers and skilled craftspeople themselves has been shrinking. And perhaps especially with the revival of interest in craft, there's been much complacency that craft practice will always be there. But this lack of concern for the wider making ecosystem is now coming home to roost. Apologies for some of the paler colours here. So these figures, overall figures I'm showing you, mask a precipice that we're actually about to fall off, or in danger of about to fall off, and which is indicated in the interview quote I opened with. Australia is about to lose the last cohort of formally paid workers who were trained and learned their skills in times of a denser making, mass onshore production ecosystem, and with a more diverse technical education supported to support all that. What current skills base does exist is largely grounded in an ageing population of skilled workers, and many of these people aspire to retire shortly if they haven't already been able to. And as they do, accessing skilled Australian craft workers will become further rarefied and pushed to the margins of affordability. With them goes access to modes of production based on material stewardship and deep knowledge, which are often more sustainable but almost certainly less affordable than buying cheaper products with an uncertain provenance from a big box retailer. And note too that the textile sector here is the one in the biggest trouble. It's the one at the top there that's the oldest overall. The average employee in textiles is over 45 years old at the moment, whereas wood, which includes building and construction, is obviously doing a little bit better. And I'll just quickly note that the Australian fashion industry is not alone in being largely ignored in policy terms in favour of the large, more male-dominated mining, construction and defence sectors. And this is something the Australian Fashion Council has been fabulous at actually advocating around. Engaging a parochial and somewhat colloquial phrase, I've referred in previous work to this as Australia's policy blokeism, that is about a culture of governing focused on looking after the ordinary man, passing the pub test, driven in large part still, I would argue, by the sociality of elite, especially men, but not exclusively. And while Australia's moment of peak blokeism may have passed with the defeat of the Conservative Morrison government in 2022, some making bodies continue to be able to flex more political muscle than others, reinforcing a limited gendered, raced, ableist and classed picture of who makes and what they make in Australia. But Australia's manufacturing decline is hardly unique around the globe. Deindustrialisation, as you probably know, occurred in Australia at a similar time as much of the rest of the global north, when the shift to globalised trade led to the outsourcing of production to cheaper labour countries, and often less regulation. But whereas many other similar economies responded by diversifying and innovating their economic base, Australia's economic growth occurred through a heavy emphasis on a small number of industries, with mining, defence and construction at the forefront. the enormous wealth generated by iron ore, coal, oil and gas exports has served to mask an economy largely based on the extraction and trade of raw materials rather than the value adding of them. As a result, the Australian making ecosystem is one that is in trouble, but the problem remains fairly invisible economically. As the Harvard University's Atlas of Economic Complexity demonstrates, Australia may be a globally rich country, but we do not have an economy which values making and sustaining our material and natural world, despite increased government policy emphasis on building sovereign manufacturing capacity. Consequently, the Australian economy is quoted as less complex than expected for its income level and ranked 93 out of 133 countries on their atlas. There we go. So, for me, what this project has meant is that while much of my research is focused on making bodies that look like them, I've spent much of the last 5 years also engaging with makers whose workplaces look far less Instagrammable. To give you a feel for some of the people and the businesses who participated in this study, what they do and why this matters, I'll hand over briefly to some of our research participants.
Being someone that makes things is super important to me because I'm literally creating something from nothing. So it's birthing something, it's bringing something to life.
It's hard to make things in this country and costs are rising, all the rest of it. But what's, I think, really satisfying is that we operate in an area of such kind of passion, and the needs of our clients sort of go beyond just the making of the object. It's very much kind of a nexus of service.
We as glassblowers will come to a position where we're designing something that can actually be made in glass as opposed to a CAD drawing which just says make this. So we need to integrate how we're going to make something as opposed to just the initial drawing they've got in their head.
We're a knit development and innovation company. We do small batch manufacturing as well. Our focus is on pushing knit into 3D seamless products, which minimises the manufacturing process and material waste.
I think what we do, it's a micro niche servicing an important and vibrant part of our culture, you know, the nexus of manufacturing and creativity and art. And without it, I think we're just at a risk of becoming a homogenous, boring working culture that just, you know, builds apps and buys stuff that you chuck out 6 weeks later.
So why do we need to care about the loss of making skills in the Australian community and economy? Because I argue they are central to reimagining how we live more sustainably in times of climate crisis. For as another of our research participants stated, I look around and I go, we're getting dumber. And I use the word dumber as we're losing the ability to solve the most basic problems. So as our society no longer has the ability to start and build things or repair things, there'll be a certain point where all we can do is throw it away. And I find I often look at the things on the side of the road and we no longer have the ability to go, how does that work? The box and the thing in it has no relevance to a person who can pull it apart. Ask how does it join together, what does it do? At that point you're a consumer and society is based purely on consumerism. So today, what capacity remains means that craft skills in Australia can and do enable both niche and mass production. They are implicated in everything from small-scale, high-end custom bikes to textile manufacturing, as well as practices of repair and maintenance. However, as I've already discussed, across much of the global north and Anglosphere countries in particular, the future of material production remains under threat on multiple fronts. And key among these, as we've seen, is the loss or simply a lack of skilled making expertise. That is, there is a kind of loss of the kind of embodied knowledges that will assist in the essential task of transforming how we connect a sense of stewardship to the ordinary things in our lives, our appliances, furniture, clothes and toys, and electronics. The reasons for this are complex and multiple, but it's against this larger backdrop that the capacity to realise a more sustainable prosperity, I would argue, is hampered by a narrow and diminishing material skill base in many of the countries contributing the most per capita to climate crisis and change. So foregrounding the central role of craft skills is a key point of contact and impact between humans and the environment. In the rest of the presentation, I wish to focus on them as enablers of care. In so doing, I seek to contribute to wider debates which challenge the growth narratives driving not only our economic but also our socio-political lives by highlighting the importance of craft skills in facilitating, and I quote, ways of living more thoughtfully within a framework of already existing materials, technologies and social relations. In so doing, I wish to argue for the contemporary importance of sustaining craft skills beyond their all too easily dismissed heritage value. Rather than being a relic of the past, I would argue that a diverse skilled craft ecosystem is central to our capacity for care for the planet, both through innovative new modes of production, as well as through the reimagining of more traditional practices in an age of climate crisis. So, to get to the care collective is the Care Manifesto, the Politics of Interdependence. This was released during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, while much of the media spotlight was finding silver linings in lockdown-induced craft, cooking and other domestic making activity. The manifesto argued that communal structures of care are central to our communities and our polities, echoing a lot of the feelings at the time. And echoing calls from broader critiques of contemporary neoliberal capitalism, it observed, and I quote again from this, as neoliberal growth policies have become dominant in so many countries, the inherently careless practice of growing the economy has taken priority over ensuring the well-being of citizens. Unquote. Instead, the Care Collective called for greater centering of care across individual and collective thought and action. This includes caring for, which includes the physical aspects of hands-on care, caring about, which describes our emotional investment in and attachment to others, and caring with, which describes how we mobilise politically in order to transform our world. So occurring alongside this, in 2000, we also saw the amount of anthropogenic mass, that is human-made mass, exceeded the weight of all global living biomass. In the global north, we are living materially beyond our means, but some are more implicated in this than others, as rising demand for off-site household storage attests to. Fashion sustainability scholar Kate Fletcher identifies Western consumer practices as grounded in a disconnection from supply chains, material and manufacturing processes, from timeframes and geographies and contexts of use. Drawing upon the work of Richard Sennett, she argues, and I quote, modern society is de-skilling people in the conduct of daily life, unquote. And a key consequence of this particular de-skilling, I would argue, is precisely the profusion of excess. After all, waste needs to be produced. After all, waste has to be made. It is a becoming and thus not a stable ontological category. Such wasteful attitudes to consumption can therefore be understood as part of a direct outcome of the loss of the visibility of manufacturing, its inputs and its impacts across much of the global north. Consumer waste in this context is also clearly the antithesis of care. Yet at the heart of both common sense and more formal definitions of craft, crafting and craft person is a sense of respect for materials and skilled knowledge in their use. Over the last half century, there's been a strong and largely successful push across the global north to connect craft practice more strongly to the arts. And this has been an important part of making arguments for the value of crafts and the importance and presence of crafts, for example, its recognition in galleries, the art galleries I spend my weekends in. And it's been a really good thing, for craft to be recognised in this way. But occurring alongside the offshoring of manufacturing, this has arguably come at the cost of a loss of more established links between craft, design and the making of everyday objects, that is, manufacturing. In the future, humans will still need stuff in our lives, but deciding what forms this take, how this moment of use by any individual or group can be located in a more integrated material economy is clearly among one of the most pressing challenges of our time. Yet despite this, as design historian Jessie Adams Stein has written, today in the global north, industrial craftspeople are almost invisible, even as they become increasingly valued in niche contexts, including as part of the artisanal economy. So for this reason, it's necessary for us to reimagine the connection, I would argue, between craft skills and production, including by more strongly reconnecting cultural manufacturing and innovation policies. So the offshoring of manufacturing, which began in the 1970s as a direct result of the policies of the time, means today many of us are completely separated from the realities of what goes into the making of our everyday material world. This lack of direct, in-your-face familiarity with the impacts and realities of different kinds of production scales and ethics remains a challenge for the skilled Australian craft workers who go to market with more expensive offerings than those available from elsewhere. In the words of Simona Gias from Symmetry, pictured here, we've globalised mass manufacturing. We've lost the connection to understanding the real cost of something. We've been buying fashion accessories under $100 because of mass manufacturing, and they're not realising what the true cost of that was. But when you're taught the skill, and the more people that understand how things are actually produced, it's going to help people understand why a leather bag might cost $1,000 because we're enabling them to see the full process and see the care that we take through that process, and to also give them the skills to repair it at the end of it as well. Because our bags can really last forever if it's looked after, if it's cared for. Fast fashion has really done the world a disservice for making things so cheap that it's easier to buy a new one than to repair the old one. So while acknowledging that the current price point for Australian-made goods can clearly be a barrier to access for many, as our research participants noted, this is a particular problem in a marketplace where the availability of cheap, high turnover, often lower quality items, enabled by who knows what kind of labour or environmental practices, shapes the expectations of the majority of consumers. As such, the internationalised free trade environment, which led to offshoring and thus a decline in craft skills in countries like Australia, now offers up cultural as well as economic barriers to the adoption of new, more careful ways of engaging with our everyday material worlds. However, despite this, although the initial barrier to entry may be higher, buying with attention to care and material stewardship is becoming steadily more desirable as an idea, if not a reality, in the face of climate crisis. As is now well established, the increasing alienation from manufacturing processes has been a key driver in the renewed interest in modes of artisanal craft and making. And I would also point out it's also been a key driver of a real upsurge in the second-hand market and people really respecting and engaging with that. This third wave of interest in craft and the artisanal is marked by its white middle-classness, and this reality needs to be acknowledged. But it also potentially offers a vector of hope or opportunity, given its clear indication that some feel too much has been lost and needs to be sustained or reclaimed. These are people often willing and able to pay a premium for things made with care. And in the words of another of our interviewees, as a woodworker, I feel it's my job to make something out of that tree that's going to last longer than the tree took to grow if the planet is going to go forward. I sleep really well at night using 3,000-year-old wood because I know with a little bit of care, these tools will last forever. That's from Colin Clenton, a toolmaker. There's also a parallel awareness among producers themselves that buying Australian-made items, even if it means paying more, is a necessary act of caring that maintains the viability of local production. But while there's still fairly niche emphasis on buying Australian-made will render more visible the processes and hence impacts of manufacturing to some, this alone will not address the challenges we face, obviously. Rebuilding a skilled craft ecosystem without the kind of manufacturing environment Australia had in the mid-20th century, and also the migration patterns we had around that, which were key to that as well, will be difficult. Indeed, even where entry-level opportunities such as apprenticeships exist, the demand for trades workers means there is little reason to learn something deeply, to master or mistress a craft, when well-paying jobs are on offer for those with even minimal skills. And one of the things we heard from a lot of people we're speaking to, especially in the construction industry, was very few of the people they will get employing would finish their apprenticeship. There are just too many good jobs out there immediately the moment you could, do a new build, get some nice, timber it in straight, clean lines or whatever basic skills she had, and go and do new builds. But the people who see out their apprenticeship and then maybe do more years with somebody who's really skilled are the ones that can go in to do a repair, are the ones that are working on buildings like this. Stonemasonry is a job really in demand in Australia at the moment because we're actually at a point in our life where we've got buildings like this that need care, but we don't have too many stonemasons. So that was one of the biggest challenges that people were saying. Even where there were apprenticeships, people aren't seeing them out. So significantly too, such a shallow level of skill acquisition does not set up these workers well to be innovators of new, more careful materials or methods. So to return to the manifesto, principles of localness and direct responsibility for and visibility of the impacts of production are at the heart of more careful economies called for by the authors of the Care Manifesto. And as it says here, wherever possible, they feel, markets should also be locally embedded. Local markets are better suited for cultivating relationships among producers, traders and consumers. They can address local needs, stimulate placemaking and community making, and provide a shield against the interests of transnational capital, making them better suited for caring purposes. They are more likely to be deeply entrenched within an ideology of sustainability and translocal solidarity, rather than being driven by parochial or paternalistic logics. So there are very, very important caveats to be made around the idea of only pursuing local production, especially where ecosystems are not optimal for a particular item. Sometimes seeking out goods locally made elsewhere may be a lower impact option. I think cotton's one of the more obvious examples of this potentially in Australia. But while this kind of embeddedness of manufacturing within localised economies may seem idealistic, it is important to remember that, while it is often large-scale, highly automated manufacturing that we see in the media or on political announcements, the reality is that 95% of manufacturing in Australia is undertaken by small to medium-sized businesses. Increasingly, the capacity of this kind of smaller-scale manufacturing is increasing alongside the development of making technologies which enable scaled-up niche production, in particular kinds of digital tools you are seeing here. This includes the more careful production practices of making to order when goods are required and have already been sold. And the use of digital tools can also mean you only use as much material as you need to produce the particular garment. We saw that with the knitting machine to some extent in the video. It's 3D knitting of wool, so you don't actually, it's not like you're cutting a fabric and getting rid of the offcuts. It's just what you need for that thing. So the use of digital tools to enable customisation and economically sustainable scaling up for the business was something that was very evident in the project. In interviews, a lot of the equipment was coming in from overseas during COVID and it had to set it up via Zoom, which was its own challenge, but it was a really big part of what was going on. So all different kinds of tools are becoming increasingly ubiquitous. Similarly, for many of the textile producers we interviewed, such as Nick Renters from the Great Ocean Road woolen mill, pictured here of his new Pride and Joy, which arrived in between our interview and the photographer going to see him. Digital looms and fibre processing machines are enabling the scaling up of sole trader or family-sized manufacturing, which in turn opens up new opportunities for forms of happiness that people might be able to enjoy were they to opt for the alternative economic order, opening up a new political imaginary. That new forms of happiness quote is from the Care Manifesto, and I just want to show you Nick being very happy with his products there. So, correspondingly, 3D printers capable of working with materials beyond plastics. We've all seen the 3D printers throwing out lots of plastic things. They can work with other materials. They're just more expensive to do so, and we don't often see them doing this. But they're revolutionising industries like 3D printing, bike manufacture. Ben Schultz from Bastion Cycles is proud that they brought to the market the world's first commercially viable titanium-printed bike. And now they specialise in luxury performance racing bikes, almost made to order, uniquely crafted for their owner. The team behind Bastion Cycles themselves notably formed when they were all about to be laid off from one of the car-making manufacturers in this state. So their skills that they brought to that particular bike company all came from the back end of what was left of Australian car manufacturing. So the loss of such thick manufacturing ecosystems have long supported the development of craft skills will in the future limit genuine innovation and thus new, more sustainable opportunities for future making. the result of both the individual and community level is a new kind of vulnerability. Acknowledging the importance but also the fragility of craft skills empowers the exploration of ideas of the economy, not as a set of global forces out there impinging upon us, but as an internal question of how humans access, use and value material resources as moral and social beings, as Gibbs and Carr and Warren have written. So despite the persistent dominance in government policy and economic practice of neoliberal principles, as the Care Collective observe, it is increasingly understood that the idea of economic growth will float all boats and that it will deliver prosperous, cohesive societies has been severely challenged in recent times. This has led to calls for an economic system that puts human well-being front and centre. Framed in this manner, moving forward in a spirit of care which foregrounds the joy and autonomy those with craft skills experience in their engagement with the material world, enables us to better approach maintenance and repair, making do with less and reimagining our production ecosystems beyond the terms of a deficit model. Such an approach would bring more people back into contact with what actually goes into the making of the things that they use, the everyday objects in our world, and thus the consequences of the choices made when purchasing or otherwise obtaining goods. But while the practice of making do with fewer but ideally better quality things is slowly shedding its negative associations with thrift and self-reliance, the capacity to embrace such living, as we know, with agency rather than through a lack of choice, remains, as we know, marked by levels of economic privilege. The challenge of addressing growing inequality and rising binaries of have and have-nots is a larger question here, but one very much in keeping with an ethics of care. Moving beyond the idea that we have to give up our material comforts to live in a world marked by a climate crisis, valuing and rebuilding craft is an essential part of the project of seeking alternative forms of hedonism. To go once again back to the Care Collective, not the Car Collective, of new kinds of individual experience involving new ideas about the aesthetics of material culture and the satisfactions it provides, and a heightened sense of the potential power of consumption or non-consumption, end quote. That is part of a project of learning to live more carefully. Now, how am I going for time? Everyone wants to get back to the bar, but just quickly. I mentioned at the beginning I would get back to the role of creative industries policy in creating this particular moment. And this one's more for the creative industries boffins here, people who do creative policy. I'm not looking at anybody in particular. But I want to make just a point about the missing sewers. And I also want to get in, hopefully, at least one feminist materials quote to make Larissa happy, because she'd be so disappointed in me if I didn't. I just want to, I've focused a bit on textiles in this, and I don't across the whole body of work, but I think it's a really good one to look at for some of the intersectional challenges here. It's both a feminised industry, but it's one that the problem of why there aren't any sewers gets back to the question of who gets to follow their dream, who gets to be somebody doing the thing within the creative economy that's the really sexy, fun thing, and who's having to do sort of the work behind that, supporting it, often not well, about to say remunerated. That was right. It's not the one where you go in first, remunerated. It's remunerated. And also there is, I get to be a professor and you still can't say these things properly. And I think we need to also acknowledge that even within the Australian making ecosystem and textiles, there is a really horrible history of piecework, underpaying and inequality. It's a whole space that needs to be opened up and thought about in terms of revaluing those skills and paying them properly and giving good pathways to people who do want to go into sewing. And that is something the Australian Fashion Council are looking at. What's the pathway to somebody who starts as a sewer? Can they become a designer? So to go back to the more academic question here, it gets down to, as I said, the who gets to follow their dream and whose work enables this. So if I focus in on textiles just for a moment, this is a graph that represents the cultural identity of people in these particular industries as declared, a country of birth as declared on the census. You'll note that sewing machinist, the fact that these two are coming together, it has really low numbers of people born in Australia, really high numbers of people born in Southeast Asia. Whereas you go down to here, which is footwear production machine operator, footwear factory worker. These are ones, once again, high rates of people born overseas versus low rates of people born in Australia. Go to fashion designer, lots of people born in Australia. So we can see the intersectional challenges here, and Larissa's left before I can get to the quotes. But there's... But I just want to point out, there's a challenge here. We advertise, especially, we're all, at least those of us who sort of go to open days. We talk up the creative industries. I'm in effectively a college called UniSA Creative, and we're selling the dream of being a creative worker, just getting to do what you love. But the reality is the world is much more complex and supported in this way. There you go. There was my Susan Lee Starr quote. The reason why I actually think we need to rethink some of the creative industries policy approaches is precisely this issue of how you approach and think through what is creativity. And I'll just let people take their photographs of that, because I'm always excited when people take photographs. And I just want to draw your attention to, for those of you who know this, there'll be a few people in the room who are familiar with this. The creative trident model was developed by colleagues at QUT, the Queensland University of Technology, in the 90s through the early noughties. And it was their way of trying to unpack how we identify the creative economy. So at the core there, you have your specialist creatives. These are people that are both doing a creative job, they've got a creative occupation, and they're working in a creative industry. And so often when people looked at studies, they're considered sort of, the uber creatives. They're the people we put in our open day publicities, people working in the film industry on film sets, not people working doing ads for big multinational, companies. These are the people that they're living the dream. Now, the reason I just want to draw our attention to this particular model, there's all sorts of critiques of it. There are people in this room who've engaged in some of the critiques of it. But where would you put sewers there? Where would you locate them in the creative economy? Chances are they're probably there. And so we've sort of just reduced this whole sort of sphere of action to management and support staff within our thinking. And so we're at this point where we're producing so many more fashion designers and people who identify as fashion designers than we are the people who are going to create the industry that's going to support them. So while the creative trident model has been useful, it's served really important purposes. It's been used to make arguments about the importance of creative labour, its presence throughout the whole ecosystem. When we think through to how future creativity is going to be sustained, I would argue we need to think more about how we open this up to sort of map the whole creative ecosystem that supports that. That's more of a sort of theoretical and sort of academic challenge, but I think it's an important one for us. We've focused in on creativity since the 1990s and the rise of creative industries policy, fine, but we're now at a point where the world is full of fashion designers, but no one who can realise their dream. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Susan. It's hard to know what to say after ending on the note that the world is now full of fashion designers, but sorry, both embrace that, and knowing that there are people from fashion and textiles in this room. But thank you so much, Susan. Fantastic talk, incredibly wide-ranging, and I imagine that we have many, many questions in the audience. I think while people are gathering their thoughts, perhaps I guess I had a question around, on the one hand, it seems you're speaking about questions of labour, classification, policy, how we develop some sense of visibility also for a whole range of forms of work that aren't necessarily visible. So, for instance, over the last year, I've been working with colleagues in the food space, in cafes. And I think that's actually a very interesting area in which much of what goes on in the cafe space gets defined as hospitality, but as in fact it's creative, I would see as creative labour. Yeah. And that was something that came up time and time again in our discussions with folk on the ground, and they said they often felt very undervalued because what they do is seen in a sort of generic service way. Yeah. So I think there's some interesting things there. But so I think you're making an argument about labour, but also an argument about, in a sense, citizenship, for a better sense of the word, moving beyond consumption to new forms of citizenship that engage with materiality and the fact that if we're going to exist in the Anthropocene and survive, that we're going to have to move towards being new kinds of beings, in a sense. So I guess my question is around how you see those two big questions speaking to each other, and in part because I've done lots of work around kind of ethical consumption and work with households where they are seeing themselves as consuming differently and often would see themselves as producers as well, but not formally so. So there are a lot of the people, when we were doing research on, for instance, folk who reuse and upcycle, a lot of those folks are sewers, they're repairers, but that's not their primary job. So there's so that's not really a question. It's
three questions. No, thank you for that, Tanya. I was going to the point about the cafes. I'm doing a current ARC project looking at artisanal making, and I came together with a colleague at, I get in trouble, I call it Adelaide University of Adelaide. The new university, it's our two unis combined, is called Adelaide Uni. So we're getting told off when we say Adelaide Uni. That's the future uni. She's a specialist in food, and so we brought together craft and food in that. So we are interviewing people like patisserie, makers, and people like that, farmers, organic farmers. I remember years ago you spoke about the place-based work. When we're doing the work mapping Darwin's creative industries, we had a big argument. We didn't have a big argument, we agreed. We had an argument with the literature. We agreed to include landscape architecture, because in Darwin in particular, the outside space of your home is almost as important as the indoor, so why are we fetishising some architects over others? And I think we included high-end chefs too, because we were thinking they're not technically in the list of sort of categories, but we want to include them in our study because, a named creative chef or chef is, creative. Absolutely. To go to your really big point about how we're going to solve all this, I suppose I'm not going to go full Gibbs and Graham just yet. I think, there is a way in which that's sort of a back note to some of what I'm talking about here. And Gibbs and Graham's work on sort of sustainable economies that, not trying to sort of say that we've got to get rid of the economy because we always live in some form of transactional system, but thinking about alternative forms of economies and recognising all of those and recognising they exist now. The practices you were talking about, for example, the main, the big end of town economy that's probably in some building down there that's got a stock exchange in it. It's just one tiny fraction of the economy that we all operate in. We barter with friends, we do all sorts of things. So there is a bit of that, I suppose, in the bigger, longer-term view of what my ideal society looks like. But I think there's a point here that's sort of a more realistic one we can achieve more quickly in Australia, which is just to bring back some visibility of making. Is just that easy steps, towards bringing back ways in which we can bring proximity back, we can bring the tools back for people to repair. There's a lot of companies these days that are main high street companies who will take back your jeans or take back whatever and repair it and send it back to you. Often they now have to send them further away because we don't have the people to do that locally. There are all sorts of interesting and good business models that can start to come to bear in a very light, not changing too much kind of way if we have more of this capacity back in Australia. And I do think digital tools, the kinds of things you're seeing there, are one of the key enablers of that. Now, stuff like that costs a lot. I think that knitting machine came in from Italy, and normally you do have to pay for the person to fly in from Italy to install it and train you up in it. So one of the things that was starting to emerge in our study was the idea that, I don't know if you get, I have driven around rural Victoria recently. It's really obvious in South Australia, though, perhaps more so. You drive around sort of the Adelaide Hills and there's all these old buildings that have got cooperative written on them because the apple growers couldn't all afford to market or organise the distribution of their apples. So all the apple growers in Lenswood got together and formed a cooperative and they pooled their resources and they did that together. I think one of the things that people were sort of increasingly wanting to start to rebuild that smaller scale but economically sustainable manufacturing was, can we pool resources? So some of the companies are big enough to be able to afford that kind of technology. But in other parts of the world, there's already emerging a trend whereby you have that kind of equipment into almost a manufacturing fab lab kind of scenario so that individuals can go in and use it and play with it. And in this way, and probably a lot of the people in the room know this, you know, if you're a fashion designer, you can directly go and work and play with it and experiment with the possibilities of the tool itself and get a feel for what might be possible as part of your design practice. So it's about actually more integrated practices of the knowing how to do all the designing and then the knowing how to do. I hope that addresses your question a little bit.
And many more. Fantastic. We've got a roving mic here, so we can come to you with the mic. Mark.
Fantastic talk, Sue, thanks. I think you should be at RMIT. Our motto, of course, going back to days when we were working men's college, was skilled hand and a cultivated mind. Very apt for your talk, I thought. And it's nice to see that you're on your slides, you're RMIT trusted. I think it's very apt.
RMIT what, sorry?
At the top there. It's our little watermark we put on everything.
Oh, right, yeah. We're still Asian buddies for another year yet.
The question I wanted to ask was about the alignment between digital analogue and care. And, you know, the sort of theme to some extent of your talk was that there is something specific about the analogue and making in analogue spaces and care. But, you know, I think you can talk about care in the digital as well, and I was called to mind a really nice quote from a games designer who was a graduate of RMIT from the School of Art, who came back and gave a talk to some graduate students here, games graduating students. Michael McMaster, who was part of the team who made Untitled Goose Game, and he had this idea that the value that RMIT gave him was learning to care. He had this idea that higher education often thought about learning to think, but particularly in the creative areas, you can also think about it as learning to care. But that is applied to a very digital product, which is games. So care can be expressed in the development of digital artefacts as well as analogue artefacts. I just wondered what you thought. It's quite a complex thing to tease out. I think there's probably something special about the analogue in relation to care, but I just wanted to know what you thought of that.
No, thank you, Mark, and thank you, as always, for a really complex, nutty question. I was worried when I sort of saw the title, again, that it sets up perhaps a dichotomy I'm not wanting to make so strongly. As I said, I'm currently reading a book called The Eye of the Master, and it's on a social history of AI, I think is the subtitle. And as I said earlier, it opens with a quote from Richard Sennett, you know, from The Craftsman. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, somebody else is in that weird space where they're looking at craft and AI at the same time. So I hope through the examples of some of the digital tools, I'm really not presenting as something that's in a complete dichotomy. The fact that most of the skills acquisition a lot of people get is through the internet, is through, you know, videos, is through dialogue conducted online. So yes, absolutely. I suppose I've been revisiting lately, as part of a new book project, some of my early work on cyberfeminism, and you and I are probably both old enough to remember the heady days of the early noughties. And I'm thinking, you know, Wired and Mondo 2000 and their great hopes for the future of digital technology. It's almost as though the practices of digital care that you're talking about there, they're now the sort of the response or the minority in the digital world, whereas 20 years ago, that was the hope. You know, it was the promise. You know, we'd be able to find definitive, you know, communities of like-minded people wherever in the world they were, that you could be an isolated person in a rural community and you know, you could find people who were the same as you anywhere in the world. So I completely agree, but at the same time, I think it's kind of sad that that's become perhaps the more rebellious, revolutionary claim back that space practice rather than the dominant mode of at least some of the digital worlds that we, who aren't necessarily producing online all the time, apart from the sort of the day-to-day stuff we do, are in. You know, the social media worlds we're in are not friendly always, and especially to diverse groups of people. So yes, is the short answer.
I'll go you and then to you. Yeah.
Thank you. My one kind of leads on from the previous one, just from the opposite point of view. So I do IT. I've done IT for many years now. One of the things I found in my sector is that I need a hobby. Like, I need something outside of the sector because it's growing beyond human capability quite fast, for my opinion, at least. And so I want to do arts and crafts and stuff because I need a sense of physical sensation. Like, I care about the stuff I make online, but it's all in a 2D world. Whereas with textiles and crafts, it's all 3D. My actual question is, is there like a place where I can find actual made in Australia crafts to support the supply and demand? Or do I have to try and figure out with all those desperate marketing techniques to make you buy things that are partially made in Australia?
I'm going to be careful not to spruik anything in particular. So you're thinking of, are you thinking of finished goods, or are you thinking of the kind of things you want to start to make with yourself?
Stuff to start with.
To be honest, it's going to be tough. One of the things about Etsy is, well, let's go back. How do you make money in a gold rush? You sell shovels. And so Etsy's long made most of its money from businesses online who are selling, making goods to people. And a lot of those goods are still mostly accessed online. Sorry, from overseas, unfortunately. You can find stuff locally, but it depends on what you're going to do. And having to then sort of hunt it out, whether it's everything from trying to find locally made clays through to, there are still companies here in Melbourne who are doing some level of cloth production, but it's certainly not the kind of thing, most of the stuff you'll see in Lincraft and Spotlight's obviously going to be in from overseas, often with problematic, at times, copyright challenges, I'll say. I've heard some horror stories just in the last week around that. So it's increasingly hard to even, but it is possible for most things. I think glass you definitely can't. I know from the glass blowers, there's most of the glass that we use in art spaces in Australia is definitely not made in Australia. Good luck with that.
Thanks, Susan. I'm just interested in thinking about the solutions that you were discussing. And just thinking about some of the points that you have made in relation to the type of workforce that is working in the making spaces. And I mean, I come from a long line of proud working class folk, skilled tradespeople, seamstresses and so forth. And yeah, but they weren't well remunerated. They lived in the outer suburbs. Their kids didn't finish high school. So I'm just thinking about, I'm really very grateful to hear about, we've got too many chefs, not enough cooks,
exactly.
And so forth. But yeah, how do we build that workforce that is needed in a way where people do have rewarding work, and, we shift that. I guess it's around ideas of aspiration, it's ideas around value of, I remember my dad saying he was a proud working class man because he he came home every day and he could see something that he had made and held in his hand. But yeah, I don't necessarily have that sensation in the same way. But yeah, that's okay. I get my purpose from other areas. But yeah, I'm just wondering about that at scale that you're describing, because yeah, what you're describing is largely bespoke and boutique. A relationship to the economy as opposed to what the skills that we might need at scale.
Yeah, no, that's 100% the really important question. This, to go to the example of the fashion industry, in talking to the former head of the director of the Australian Fashion Council, she was trying to go for what are the pathways, what are the entry pathways, and can you have a career? And while I value that, I'm not convinced that's necessarily the answer. It's the idea that you're going to sort of start as a sewer and end up maybe as a designer. It just seems a weird pathway given the education setups. I'm not convinced it's going to work. So for me, it's about going back to, as you said, a well-paid job, and just changing consumer perceptions so that we actually can afford to we spend more money on a thing rather than buying 5 things, and hopefully then having proper wages for people in those jobs, not piecework, proper jobs. The scale is always going to be difficult, but I know I was in the current project, I was talking to somebody who does knitwear design or knitwear retailing, and they design it and make it, or pay for makers in Tasmania to make it. And they're currently supporting 20 sewers at one particular company. So if they go under, there's a whole ecosystem in Tasmania that's gone, but at the same time, one retail outlet is supporting 20 people, and they would argue, at least, I didn't get to see their books, that they're being paid quite well. So I think it gets down to actually providing people with proper jobs and valuing and respecting those skills. It's about what do we value. And I think one of the things, I mentioned Anglosphere countries specifically, I do think there are still pockets of even, European countries and other parts of the world, bits of, Asia, parts of the Americas as well, and Africa even, where people who make things, who sew, who do that kind of trade skill, still have a lot more respect in their community and always have, perhaps the legacy of the guild movement, which had its own sort of challenges. But there's just a cultural respect for that we have, not all of us obviously, but there seems to be lacking in the Australian ecosystem at the moment, in the Australian economy. So I do think there's space for us to be moving in ways that it's return a bit more of that. And it was interesting to hear a colleague talk about, the desire to make with your hands, and you mentioned, families' experience of being really proud of, I made that, that's what I did today. I think there is a real strength. There is something there about the fact that it is rewarding work once again. It's not just, we sell these other dreams, but I think we need to sell multiple dreams, not just, this is where the digital focus comes in. A lot of government policy has fetishised one sector as the answer to everything, while ignoring perhaps more traditional things which still have a role to play and in fact need to be reimagined as we move forward.
I'll go to you and then I'll go over to you, if that's okay. You go.
Oh, me. Thank you. Thanks, Sue. Actually picking up a theme a colleague over here mentioned in passing. I wonder how far the research you're doing in the survey of what we're talking about, which is labour remuneration, has anything to connect with the non-professional sphere. The Creative Australia calculate that 45% of Australians are involved in some kind of cultural production. I'm not suggesting that there's a untapped work supply, but it's also a sphere that is supported by an interesting economy of supply for materials. A lot of people who probably trained but didn't go into a profession. People, as you mentioned, who are self-taught through books, online tutorials. That's also where perhaps aspects of value and validation of craft and lots of other types of creativity occur. I wonder whether that's a sphere that you connect with in your own research at all.
That gets to the heart, as many people here know, of the limits of census data. Census data only captures what your main occupation was last week, and paid occupation. It doesn't capture part-time work, it doesn't capture unpaid work. I mentioned Jessie Adams Stein's work. This is a bit of an aside, Paul, I'll get back to your question in a sec. But she and Chantal Carr and others at the University of Wollongong have done beautiful work about how often the workers laid off in Wollongong, or who eventually were laid off in Wollongong, absolutely were key to their community because of all the unpaid labour they did on weekends to keep the cricket club's electricity working, to redo the roof. All the tools and stuff and skills they had kept that whole community going. And if they go and when they are no longer able to do that work, basically councils and governments might actually have to stump up and do something. So yeah, there is an absolute richness out there. I don't want to get too deep into Revive because I think we're still waiting to see the rubber hit the road on what could come from that. But I think one of the things I was worried about in that COVID moment was there was so much emphasis on unpaid making and craft that I'm worried it almost took away. It went back to it's the sort of thing you do for free. And so I got a little bit nervous actually about that moment of popularity. So I absolutely do think there's a huge amount of work out there in the community that's not been tapped into here, that could be, and that could form, if with the right jobs and the right kind of pay, to attract people away from what it is they're already doing. but at the same time, I'm always really nervous about the celebration of. No, I love the celebration of the work. I get nervous that we could sort of see a replication in that space of some of the things that happens in other creative industries, screen-based production, those kind of performance-based industries where just do this for free and you'll get a foot in the door kind of thing becomes the norm. So, yeah, swings and roundabouts there.
Thank you, Sue. I'm a usurper. I'm from VE. Sorry. We teach the craftspeople. Just an interesting point, a couple of things. We're finding that I'm in the furniture craft area, we're finding that a lot of people aren't studying our associate degree, which is a sort of sub-degree of higher education, because they're all doing short courses for 3 or 4 weeks in furniture making. So that there are a lot of people out there actually providing services for people who want those short courses, and post-COVID, there's we've lost, I think, a lot of mature males that we've lost out of our system. The second point is that we've been advertising our program this year, and we've had 3 schools contact us saying, can you provide teachers for us? So the issue I see is actually the education of the craftspeople and not the education of the craftspeople. It's actually the educating of the teachers of the craftspeople we've lost in schools. And the issue we have is that most of the students we see coming through schools now are great 3D printers, but they've got no hand skills. Yeah. And it's a real problem. The education system is driven by money, I'd say, and sort of uses of land and uses of teachers' resources, and we're struggling to get students who actually have the making skills and understanding what materials are. It's a real problem. And the final point, I'd ask you questions. What about the value of money? Because I've noticed my wife's a primary school teacher, and she struggles to teach the kids what a coin is anymore because they don't know what a coin is, because they don't buy things through physical money. So is the value of money changing, which means the value of how people see things, because they don't save up money anymore, it's all on digital. So the digitisation of money is actually changing our value of everything as well.
Thank you.
Have you thought about that?
No, that's really fascinating, especially in that analogue digital context.
It's a real problem because you buy through TikTok, you buy through Instagram, you don't physically see an object anymore, you don't touch it and feel it.
Yeah.
So the generations coming through now won't understand what materiality is. They just buy it, get it, don't like it, throw it away.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about that, so thank you very much. I remember that when 2-cent coins, I'm showing how old I am again. I remember when 2-cent coins were taken out of circulation because the copper value in them was more than the face value of the coin. So you're better off melting them down than carrying them around. I can see why that has a very tangible perception. It's all just on your card and zipping around. I suppose it's the way in which, in the last 12 months in particular, it's become standard just to have a 1.4% fee on most transactions, where it used to be just some. And we just, oh yeah, we'll do that. It just becomes part of your norm. So thank you for reminding me of that. It's interesting you mentioned the skills story and just that sort of comfort with making things. I was in the classrooms in the 1990s when people would walk into a computer lab for the first time, and I'd have to reassure people that they weren't going to break the internet by just giving it a go. Especially some of the mature age students were just nervous about sort of, playing around with it because they just weren't digital natives. Very few people were back then. Whereas now it's almost like, you give people some wood and some hammers and some nails and you have to reassure them that as long as you don't whack your thumb, you're going to be able to do something. It's, just give it a go. It's turned almost on its head, and we see that, as you were saying, coming through the school systems. It's interesting, your first point there. I was following up just informally, not in an interview, some people from the Sturt School in New South Wales, and they were almost beside themselves with just sadness that the people they used to have coming in for their more advanced furniture making cabinetry classes, they're just having to sort of do remedial 101. And it's no criticism of anybody's. They weren't coming from any particular place, obviously, but they just found people thought they could walk in and with some probably short courses do the high level of things that were required there without actually giving thought to what that level of skill was. And that is one of the challenges. It's harder to do the 3-year degree or the 4-year degree or the 2-year masters or whatever. Yeah. So, yes.
Oh, there's some.
And then we'll do that.
Okay, all right. Hi, thank you. I'm going to take inspiration from what he said, directly from the craftsman. I'm a fashion technologist turned sociologist. I'm doing something that relates to human nature interconnectedness. I'm from fashion as well. So I strongly believe that majority of the problems that we are facing today is the disconnection we have from nature. And as a part of study that I'm willing to do is that if we could connect back to nature, maybe we could improve our consumption practices. So craft is one of the part that I'm studying. He reminded of something that I did a couple of years back, studying about the factors that was affecting handicraft in India. So basically, I picked a handicraft that I have seen in a day-to-day life, especially with my life, where my grandmother was using it, and then my mother was using it. So I saw it die. So as a part of the project, the craft revival thing, I have been to that place and I've lived with those craftsmen. And one of the the challenge that they are facing is that defining craft authenticity in a digital world, where craftsmen, craftswomen, forced to rely on digital tools, for example, to give innovation. The craft that I took was a basic palmyra basket, basket weave, up and down basket weave. So when people were asking about innovation and that, they could maybe tweak a little bit in terms of weave. And after a few years, they came up with material innovation. For example, they combined with plastic, they combined with nylon, and consumers wanted new colors, so they wanted synthetic dyes. So over a period of time, the level of authenticity have been declining with the use of digital technology as well. Well, simultaneously, I've been in Indonesia for 8 years as well. The same basket, palmyra basket, was in West Kalimantan. What they are doing is that they have launched their first digital asset to be launched in Metaverse. The same basket launched in Metaverse as a digital asset. So my question here is, where do we put a line between craft, original craft, and a digital version of it? Because altogether it becomes like plastic. And I've seen Zara launching a basket weave, inspired from this particular kotan. The handicraft is called kotan. One particular season, like spring, summer 2018 or so. So where do we put a line between a traditional craft versus a craft that has used a digital technology to some extent?
Yeah, that's a big one. Because there's also issues of IP in there as well that you hinted at very clearly there towards the end, which is just a completely unresolved tension. It depends what you want to be, though. If the Palmyra weavers want to stick with the tradition, I suppose it's up to, in that context, I suppose it's about what the community want from it. Are they upset that they're going too far away from what it is? Because I personally don't think digital tools in and of themselves are a bad thing. But if it's taking people away from something they don't want, too far away from what they were doing, if it's perhaps unproductive, if it's unsustainable, if the dyes aren't good to be used in the local community because it pollutes waters, it's just, there's all sorts of reasons why I think it's about the context and what people are after it for. Because on the other hand, I'm aware of people around the world who have ended up producing goods, authentically local, historically made goods for tourists who insist upon just having the thing that's the original thing without giving them space for innovation and for change. So I think in many ways these have to come back to the communities themselves. What's in it for them, things they're willing to trade off for income versus their own sense of authenticity, and where they're happy sitting things themselves. The intellectual property issue remains a huge one for people the world over. There was a beautiful example in a book on fashion where people are familiar in Australia with the kinds of sort of red, white and blue big bags you can get for like $1 that we've all probably got to move around laundry or do house moves. I think it was Balenciaga released a version of that, effectively the same thing with their logo on it for like $2,000. The particular bag was it was multicoloured. It was associated with a particular market. And so it wasn't just that generic bag. It was the same kind of thing though. And so people, ironically, ended up putting fake Balenciaga logos onto the one they got at the market for like 50 cents and going, Balenciaga. But they had no legal recourse, and there's examples from local people as well as people around the globe of that. It's even in the face of things like the Berne Convention, international rights, it's who's got the most expensive lawyers or the deepest pockets to pay the most expensive lawyers, and it tends not to be individual makers.
This is the last question. I was thinking of the idea they don't make them like they used to. And my question, and I'll tell you why I ask it in a minute, but my question's really, can we get the crafts back? And, well, I'm not, does that matter? Maybe you don't need to answer that, because I'm wondering if we can get them back. And I'm looking at this on the screen where he says, I think so much has just been lost at that back end when a fashion designer sets an idea, draws a pretty picture and gets all the glory. And it's been the work of dozens of people behind the scenes to make that through to reality. You should hero those people who actually make, not just those people who draw the picture. And I think there's a bit of a dichotomy, which Rachel alluded to. Like, I'm a creative person with ideas, so I think I make things. So, but I have experience to me that you don't make things idea, but I resist it. But anyway, back to my question. My mother was a fashion designer, and she, at 12, was forced to leave school, and she went into a pattern cutting room and she swept the floor. Then she learnt how to put the weights on the patterns. Then she learnt how to use the sewing machine. And eventually she was what you called back in the day a couturier. And she knew how to do everything. And one time late in life, she worked for a very big designer here in Melbourne. And she came home and she said to me, she'd only been there 6 months, and she said, it so gives me the shits. They've just employed this young designer out of RMIT. She's just first year out, and they haven't got $150,000 worth of orders they can get because they think they haven't got enough fabric. They have got enough fabric, they just don't know how to cut it. And which I think relates to this kind of idea, because once upon a time, you got that craft because you worked your way up and you knew every bit of those, which this guy obviously doesn't know that, that designer, maybe these days designers are not that same thing, but once upon a time the designer didn't know what all those people do, and that's how they could design it. So my question, which I've now forgotten, which I think was something to do with, could you really get the crafts back, or are they gone?
I'm really conscious this question came from you, Lisa, and this is why I've been banned from my provost from speaking at Open Day. I think, because I have the stats on creative employment, I think one of the challenges there, that's exactly the pathway that used to be there, and I think that's the one the Australian Fashion Council would like to get back, those kind of, you learn all aspects of your trade before you get to be the senior person. And pattern makers is one of the other areas it's really under threat at the moment. But that's not what we market at universities. We're actually part of the problem here. And I'm not saying what we're doing is wrong, but one of the pressures I don't need to tell you we're under is the winding back of the studio spaces to do that kind of work and replicate it. We probably could try and figure out ways in which we could do work integrated learning to try and replicate some of that, but it's the way that we're sort of all having to respond to the current moment, that people are coming in here rather than having that sort of bottom-up experience. And yeah, we're part of that scenario, that we advertise the courses in that creative core and the careers in the creative core. Perhaps less so than RMIT. I'll acknowledge the fact you have, a fabulous textiles department. It's something that's actually quite leading in the world. The one place that actually keeps coming up in my mind when I talk to people and when I talk to people about where they've studied. For us, it's sort of glass blowing is one of the things we're really proud of the fact that we actually held on to. But keeping that kind of studio space going to do that hardcore, serious, immersed work at a university context is getting harder. So more and more you can get those dichotomies, which are unfair, and that is deliberately provocative. But it's getting harder to keep the richness of that going. Because the easiest way to know what the possibilities are to know how to make it yourself. This project started when I interviewed somebody for a previous project, and she knew the guy who was in his 80s. He was a shoemaker in the UK, and he literally wrote the book on shoemaking in the UK. And he'd had to come out of retirement because lots of, I can't mention company names because this is being recorded, but basically huge international companies that we'd all recognise were paying him to fly to China and to fly back and to fly to head offices in New York and all around the world to explain to the executives how to make a shoe. Because they were saying, we send the designs to China and what comes back isn't what we want, and we don't know how to tell them what we want because we don't know how to make a shoe. So he was going around talking to executives about how you make a shoe. That's this part of the shoe, that's that part of the shoe. Do you need this up, down? This is how you talk to people who know how to make shoes. So it's that sort of missing connection that, too much of our economy has got, whereas the situation that your mother was in many ways is ideal. Know the grassroots, know the experience of the people that you're going to give direction to in the future, so that in the future, hopefully, you are better towards them as employees or colleagues. Is also another part of that experience. If you've been there, hopefully you can have a better feel for the experience of it. But thank you for that question. We're doing ourselves out of jobs here.